Hello, and welcome to the Agiloft webinar series. I'm your host today, Danielle Haugland, Global Alliance Director at Agiloft. I am a former big law litigator turned legal tech and contracting enthusiast by way of a long and windy road. And I've traveled much of that road with our guest today, Mark Ross, Principal in Deloitte's Legal Business Services Group. Mark is a recognized specialist in legal services innovation, a fellow in the College of Law Practice Management, sits on the advisory boards of Suffolk Law School's Institute of Law Practice, Technology and Innovation and Northwestern University Law School's Center for Practice Engagement and Innovation. Oh, that's a lot. And he is a frequent speaker on legal managed services and contract lifecycle management specifically. So welcome, Mark.
Lovely to be here, Danielle. Thank you for having me.
No problem. Well, we're really excited to have you today because we're talking about the post-award phase of contracting. That is what happens after a contract is signed. The answer is, of course, plenty. Ensuring compliance with terms and conditions. In other words, getting the value bargained for. Managing contract amendments, adhering to production requirements, resolving claims and disputes, and measuring commercial performance. This all seems pretty darn obvious, right? The entire point of a contract is to get something of value. So it's very important to focus on contract creation, and we do plenty of that, but it's equally important to nail down post-award management. Before we dive in, let's get some housekeeping out of the way. Today, we're aiming for a 20 to 25 minute discussion followed by questions, which our audience can pose in the Q&A. And we'll do our best to get to everyone's questions within the time that we have, and we'll follow up on any we can't squeeze in today. So, Mark, let's get started with the basics. What is post-award? What is the post-award phase, and how does it fit into the contract lifecycle?
Thanks, Danielle. And again, thanks for inviting me to join today. Delighted to be here. It's a great framing question, Danielle. There's a couple of ways that you can look at that. You can look at it and it's incredibly simplistic, what was promised versus what was delivered. But I also like to, first of all, acknowledge the terminology, and the terminology post-award, that is often and correctly used interchangeably with post-signature, referencing the activities and phases that can and should occur after a contract is signed, stating the obvious, but that's what it is. You can typically segment those activities into two different buckets. Firstly, compliance with the legal components of contractual relationships, notices and notifications, change orders, renewals, amendments. But the other bucket, that includes the commercial obligations, invoicing, discounts, performance management. That's frequently referred to as commercial management. And what I would say, Danielle, as well, is both of these buckets of activities and phases are inextricably linked together with the common thread that is management information reporting.
Got it. So thanks so much for that primer on what the contract lifecycle is and how the post-award phase fits into that. And now we're going to move on to why the post-award phase is getting so much attention these days. So Mark, Deloitte teamed up with the WCC to publish a report titled "When Technology Meets Humanity, the Future of Contract Management." It was a fascinating read, by the way, and I encourage all of our listeners to give it a look. One of the takeaways that struck me was the conclusion that it's the post-award phase of contract management that value is won or lost. What did you mean by that?
Great question. And interestingly enough, it was in an earlier World Commerce and Contracting report where they assessed and analyzed what they defined as friction points and value in commercial contracting. And they found that 70% of friction points, potential areas for disagreement, they occur before the contract is signed. But the other side of the coin here, 70% of the time and cost involved in contracting occurs post-signature, during the contractual performance. So what you really need to ask is, why is that the case? And at its most simplistic, Danielle, companies have invested a disproportionate amount of time, effort, funds into the pre-signature phase. But why? Again, it's quite simple. The must-have versus the nice-to-have conundrum. Companies must have contractual agreements in place to enable the business to actually function. Whereas it's nice for companies to have an effective and efficient post-signature contract and commercial management in place. I think it was another study from WCC that found that 9.2%, Danielle, of actual annual contract value is lost through poor management across the entire life cycle, but with the majority of that lost value taking place in the post-award, the post-signature phase. Just have a think through the wide range of post-award issues that come into play that impact directly commercial value: price changes, invoices, late payments, service levels, discounts, auto renewals, to name just a few. And on top of that, while this may seem incredibly obvious, I want to give credit to one of my Deloitte colleagues, Craig Conti, in one of his recent articles. He noted the obvious, that unless you're a startup organization, it's an absolute certainty that you will have many, many more contracts already executed than you'll be entering into in a given year. And purely based on the volumes at play, it stands to reason that it's in the post-award phase that value is lost or won.
That makes a lot of sense. And you foreshadowed my next question a little bit around, why companies have focused so heavily on pre-signature versus post-signature. But let's dig into that. We can go down memory lane a bit. You and I are no strangers to the CLM space, and it really wasn't that long ago that the focus was almost exclusively on improving this pre-signature process. What's changed and why? And I know you addressed that a little bit in your preceding answer, but again, let's dig into that a little bit more.
No, great question. And what I'd say is there are a multitude of overlapping and interrelated forces at play here: a burgeoning regulatory environment, the rise of legal ops as a discipline, of course, the increased sophistication, maturity, functional capabilities, of the leading CLM technology providers, like Agiloft. But if I'm going to highlight one driver right now behind what's changed and why, I don't think we can possibly overstate the impact of the pandemic. COVID has been, horrific in many, many contexts, but it has been a catalyst for change as well. It triggered, in the contractual sense, a never before witnessed avalanche of questions about contracts. And let me be clear, these are questions about executed contracts, about signed contracts. Organizations, they need to know, whether they, their customers, their suppliers can renege on contractual commitments. Does the crisis constitute a force majeure event? Do their contracts include such a provision? Suppliers whose demand has plummeted need to look at their own supply chain contracts. What are the implications of early termination? Do the contracts allow for termination for convenience? What are the associated notice provisions? If termination for convenience isn't an option, what are the remedies? What are the rights? What are the requirements for otherwise terminating the relationship? So while I believe we would have got to where we are today in terms of the focus on the post-award phase in due course, the pandemic has unequivocally accelerated the pace of change.
Got it. So you mentioned an earlier WCC report about friction points, and you noted that 70% of the time and cost occur post-signature during contract performance. how have organizations been handling the post-award, and how can it be improved?
Great question. Well, what our research has clearly shown, is that the balance of that focus, pre-award versus post-award, is definitely changing. Organizations are investing time, money, effort into a multitude of key post-award areas, analyzing and assessing and re-engineering the post-signature processes, introducing more robust, more comprehensive approaches to both legal and obligation management, investing in the multidisciplinary and cross-functional talent needed to improve post-execution contract management, and as you well know, investing in CLM technology. Our research actually showed that 68% of those surveyed indicated that an increasing digitization of contract management was for them a medium to high priority. Companies, I think, Danielle, they're embracing en masse the need to assess how contracts are managed post-execution. And there's today a never before seen appreciation of the power of data. Organizations, they're thinking beyond the four corners of the contract and the data that's in those four corners. They're thinking about how can it be linked to enterprise data in financial, in HR, in procurement, in CRM systems. If you think about it this way, Danielle, if an organization's customers, are contractually obligated to buy X volume of widgets, only by firstly being able to quickly and intuitively locate the requisite contractual data, and then secondly, analyzing that data, aligning the contractual terms with the actual invoiced amounts, and that is data that resides outside of the four corners of the contract, only then can you identify instances of revenue leakage. So I think with this new approach, this new focus, this new investment, the walls between those who draft, who create contracts, and those who then live with them, those walls start to crumble.
Gotcha. So we've established why post-award management is so important. Why is it so hard?
Great question. I think the most simplistic answer is that the majority of the operational costs, headcount, technologies associated with post-execution contract management, they are dispersed across the enterprise. They're dispersed across the organization. They may even feel or remain invisible to those involved in certain components of the process. For example, the resources responsible for the key components of contract management, interpreting and implementing the executed contract, monitoring its performance, evaluating changes or adjustments, managing and reconciling invoices, resolving shortfalls and disagreements, acceptance tests, delivery confirmation. All of those activities, they can be spread across multiple constituent stakeholders. So I think that above anything else is probably why it's so hard.
So you've teed up my next question perfectly. At a surface level, you think of one organization contracting with another, and that every person within each of those organizations are rowing in the same direction when it comes to contracting. But like you just said, sometimes people aren't even in the same boat, let alone rowing in the same direction. And even if they are rowing, rowing in sync can be a challenge given very real organizational silos. So oftentimes the people creating the contract are not the same people who have to live with it. How do we solve for that?
Another great question. Well, first of all, I think let's acknowledge that contracts are the very lifeblood of the business, strategic business assets. But with multiple stakeholders, the life cycle is undeniably complex. And I think you touched on this with your framing of the question. Contracts, they serve a variety of interests and purposes. And just, the audience today, have a think through the array of stakeholders who have an interest in contracts within the organization: executives, sales, legal, procurement, finance, IT, HR, compliance, supply chain, operations. Oftentimes, these different stakeholders, they have different priorities. They view the very purpose of contracts through different lenses. Some of them think of contracts as tools for risk management. Others think of contracts as vehicles for generating, economic benefits. Others as a framework for mutually beneficial business outcomes. Others still as a record of the legal rights, remedies, and obligations. I could go on and on and on. So how do we solve for this? Well, I wish I could pull out my singular magic one solution to all of these life's problems, but there isn't one. But what I would say is focusing on digitization of the contract portfolio, assessing and understanding the pain points as they exist across the entire life cycle, pre and post award. I think the development of contract data standards, quantifying the overall cost per contract to the organization, consolidation of resources, increased clarity over roles and responsibilities. I would identify those as some of the key steps that can be taken.
And those key steps, obviously technology is critical to those, but folks who have turned into this program before know that I am a big believer in people, process, and technology. And I know you are too. So what does that mean in the context of post-award management?
Yeah, very true. But despite the incredible advancements in the technological functionalities from the leading CLM players in the marketplace and the adoption of those functionalities, there is definitely a realization that it's an enabler, it's not a cure-all. When we think about transformation of the contracting function, in legal business services, there is an acknowledgement that it is an approach that requires multidisciplinary talent. What do I mean by that? It means it requires talent from knowledge engineers, technologists, process analysts, and of course, legally trained professionals as well. It requires an approach that marries process standardization, automation, global delivery, centralization, alternative resource models, continuous improvement. And without the proper investment in people, in process, in content, then even the greatest technology in the world, it just offers at best a band-aid temporary fix. And I think if organizations can equip their legal and commercial teams with intelligent insights, leveraging technology that takes that information from the sea of data available, the opportunities for improvement are significantly greater.
Right. So far today, we've looked at the contract lifecycle and where post-award management fits, why it's so important. But let's break it down into dollars and cents. Pre-signature CLM offers a ton of benefits. One of the biggest is getting to contract faster, which is music to any CRO or CFO's ears. Another benefit is lightening the load on contract professionals so that they can focus on higher value and higher risk deals. But that's hard to quantify. What kind of benefits can organizations expect to achieve when they effectively manage their contracts post-award? Can contract management actually make an impact on the bottom line?
Well, the short and sweet answer is yes. And for many organizations, what we find is that one of the biggest issues is actually being able to demonstrate and quantify that value, to demonstrate the ROI from investing in improving the post-execution contract management phases. In fact, our research, Danielle, that showed that literally it was only, I think, a third of those organizations surveyed were actually able to provide some measure of their financial value and impact to the overall business. But to give you some concrete examples, about how effective post-award management can actually drive value, avoidance of invoicing errors, avoiding paying for unachieved service levels, deliverables, outcomes, unrealized credits and discounts, non-adherence to payment terms that can affect cash flow, and even failing to bill for contractually required work. Think about large-scale, $50 million services contracts, for example. They may be 3 to 5 years in duration. They may have 300 different deliverables involved in those relationships. The MSA may well have 25 addendums, change orders, SOWs sat underneath it. The amount of time and effort, without process improvement, without technological tools in driving value in those large-scale post-executed contract management processes, it can be incredibly costly, incredibly wieldy to their business. You leverage the best that technology has to offer and process improvement, and you can significantly reduce the manual effort in managing those contracts post-execution, and drive significant economic value to the bottom line simply by doing that.
Exactly. So everything you just said, it seems to me would really strike a chord with procurement teams, that they would be keenly interested in post-award management for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is to demonstrate the value they bring to an organization as a whole. And if a procurement organization was able to bottle up everything that you just said and deliver it to a CFO and say, hey, look, see what we've done for you, that would be a pretty good day. Is that consistent with your experience? Are procurement organizations looking at post-award management as a way to prove the value that they bring? By the way, just one more thing, and aside to that, it's not lost on me that your group is called Legal Business Services, but consistent with the theme of breaking down barriers, you also work with procurement teams, right?
Yeah, yes, of course, and it's entirely consistent, Danielle, with our approach and our experience. As I said before, it really is. It's still a minority of those that are able to quantify and demonstrate to the broader organization, the value that they bring. If there's one stakeholder group that has a greater vested interest than others, perhaps, that it would be procurement. But in legal business services, we work with all of the constituent stakeholders in this contracting ecosystem: procurement, sales, finance, IT, HR, compliance, and yes, legal too.
Gotcha. So switching gears just a bit, I want to talk about Agiloft for a second and CLM generally. One of our key themes at Agiloft as we look to the future and develop our product roadmap is elevating contracts. And you mentioned this earlier, viewing contracts not as static documents, but data that can be used throughout the organization. And one of the ways that we're addressing this is exploring the use of AI to automate obligations management. So automatically extracting obligations from a contract, routing associated tasks to responsible parties, tracking performance, et cetera. And this is a compound question. So first off, do you agree that contracts are not just documents? We know the answer because you said it earlier. That in fact, there are data assets that form the foundation of the business. And second, how do we actually get there?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, let's close off. Contracts, lifeblood of the business, not just legal documents, strategic business assets that happen to contain legal and commercial terms. They provide a framework for mutually beneficial business outcomes. They generate economic value. They're tools for risk management. They offer a formal record of rights and obligations. They provide intelligent insights to the overall business. They can even be a testament to an organization's brand and corporate values.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was awesome. So we're about at our 25-minute mark, and I'm going to close out by putting you on the spot a bit. We talked about the evolution of CLM from a focus on pre-signature to include post-award management. What do you think is next?
Well, let me just pull out my crystal ball. as we think through the next big change. I honestly think and hope, Danielle, that a culmination of our collective efforts is actually a change in perception. What do I mean by that? And it really is expanding on some of the points we talked about earlier, where contracts and the contracting process itself, rather than being viewed as legal documents that are a source of delay, confrontation, frustration, both by internal and external stakeholders, that the perception begins to change. As we talked about, contracts increasingly being viewed as strategic business assets, and that the contracting process itself, that process becomes a calling card for the overall business, a calling card that's demonstrative of collaboration, both internally and externally. And with an increased focus on the post-signature phase, what I believe is that the end result can be enhanced relationships with internal clients, but also external vendors, partners, customers. Perhaps that's my somewhat naive glasses half full perspective, but we can all but hope.
We can. I happen to agree with you. So we do have a few questions come in. The first one is directed to Mark, and it's to kindly expand on your must-have, nice-to-have point. I think that was at the top of the segment about the distinction between pre-signature and post-signature. That pre-signature was viewed really as a must-have, whereas post-signature management was viewed as a nice-to-have. So any expansion on that point?
Sure, and again, this is quite a simplistic perspective I'm conveying here. I think it's Paul who asked the question. Mm-hmm. But when I say must-have, you cannot undertake revenue generating activities. You cannot buy the goods and services that you need without contractual agreements being requested, drafted, and executed. That's what I mean by must have. Nice to have is everything that comes post signature. An organization could, if they wanted to, file that contractual document away in the virtual filing cabinet, never to be seen, heard of, or managed ever again. There are consequences for doing so, which we talked about, the lost value, but there is no gun to the head of organizations saying you absolutely must do this. What we need to do is demonstrate the value or the lost value in not so doing.
Gotcha. Another great question from Nigel, and this one, Mark, I'm also going to throw to you. In your opinion, what percentage of companies consistently examine post-award outcomes and feed this back in order to realign contract creation for stronger outcomes?
Well, I love the fact that, Nigel, you're asking me, A, what my opinion is, and then B, a specific quantifiable percentage. Off the top of my head, I'm unable to quote you the specific percentage. I can go back and look at the research that we undertook. What I would say is my opinion and my experience is that it is still the minority of organizations today that, if I look at your question, are certainly consistently doing this. When I think of the term consistent, I'm thinking that organizations are doing this as a matter of course, as a matter of routine. They are examining, they're assessing their post-award outcomes, and they're leveraging that intelligent, insightful data, to realign contract creation. It's the minority, but that percentage is increasing year on year.
All right, so we have time for one more question, and this one is coming in from Frank. And this one is intriguing to me. The question is, have you seen good examples of contract summaries as a launching point for lower level data? And it's intriguing to me because I've seen clients use contract summaries to try to get at that data analysis, the analytics that we were talking about. Mark, have you seen that used successfully?
Yeah, so the short answer is, I know it's short on time, the short answer is yes. So I've seen multiple examples of contract summaries being a tremendous, as Frank, you say, a launching point. But beyond that, they have multiple use cases. I can tell you that despite, spending 20 years in the CLM space, that I personally, when I see a contract versus a contract summary, I'll dive into the summary versus the elongated, overly obtuse legalese document that is still today most contracts. What I actually hope we get to a point is that with an increased focus on contract simplification, that actually contracts themselves start to look and feel a lot more like what you and I might view as contract summaries today, and that we start to eliminate a lot of this unnecessary legalese.
Mark, I think you've just teed up a really good topic for another webinar. Contract simplification.
Look forward to the next invite, Danielle.
No problem. All right, so we were 1 minute past the bottom of the hour. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you so much to our guest, Mark Ross. And we'll see you next week on the Agiloft webinar series. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Stay safe.